The upbeat music of Jimmy Kimmel Live blared through the studio speakers, but something in the air felt off tonight. Heavy, almost electric. Bright stage lights cut across the room like searchlights. The camera swept the crowd, catching half smiles and murmurs, and then locked onto the host's desk. Jimmy Kimmel adjusted his tie, his expression caught somewhere between charm and calculation. The announcer's voice boomed over the noise. "Please welcome White House Press Secretary Karoline Leavitt." The applause came in a mix of genuine claps and hesitant murmurs. From the wings, a tall, composed woman in her late 20s emerged with controlled confidence. At 27, Caroline had already become the youngest press secretary in modern American history. Her heels struck the studio floor with a rhythmic click, echoing louder than the music. Her tailored navy dress hugged her like armor, blending business formal with a Gen Z edge. Bold, clean lines, minimal but striking. The kind of look that didn't apologize. As she walked toward the desk, a few scattered boos slipped through the crowd noise, but she didn't flinch. She waved calmly, her lips curled into a smile that didn't try too hard. She knew exactly where she was and what kind of fight this would be. Behind the desk, Jimmy leaned in, his eyes sharp. He smiled the way late-night hosts do, just enough teeth to look harmless, but not enough to hide the hunt. Everyone in the room knew this wasn't just a segment. This was a showdown. For the audience, it wasn't just about politics. It was generational, cultural, personal. On one side, a Gen Z woman, bold, unapologetic, and aligned with a former president who remains one of the most polarizing figures in American history. On the other, a talk show veteran, trusted by millions, famous for skewering the powerful, and now staring across the desk at someone who refused to be boxed in. The music faded out. The spotlight held steady. Cameras zoomed. A low murmur ran through the crowd. And then, like the first swing of a heavyweight bout, Jimmy opened his mouth with a smirk. The crowd held its breath. They knew what was coming, and they didn't want to miss a second of it. If this video kept you watching, why not drop a like? Jimmy leaned forward on the desk, microphone just inches from his mouth, smile tight and voice light. "Caroline," he began, drawing out the name just enough to sound friendly, but not too friendly. 27 years old, press secretary to Trump, the youngest in history. I mean, do you also run the TikTok account, or is that a side hustle? Laughter rippled through the crowd. A few claps, some chuckles that sounded more like people waiting to see what would happen next. Caroline tilted her head, smiled without blinking. Her eyes stayed locked on Jimmy. "No TikTok dances in the White House, Jimmy," she said smoothly. "But if you want, I can teach you a move or two. Might help your ratings." The laughter came louder this time, a few whoops from the back. Jimmy tapped his desk with his pen, acknowledging the hit. "Touché," he said, grinning. "But seriously, working for Trump? That's got to be an experience." He shifted his weight, relaxed his shoulders. His tone dipped into something more casual but sharper. "You're the face for a man who, let's say, isn't exactly allergic to controversy." Caroline didn't miss a beat. "I'm proud to work for President Trump," she said plainly. "He says what others won't. And I make sure that message doesn't get buried under headlines written before the press briefings even start." A few claps came from the side. A low, skeptical murmur followed. The divide in the room was starting to show. Jimmy raised an eyebrow. "So you're like a translator then, helping America understand the things he says that, aren't always easy on the ears?" Caroline sat up straighter. Her smile didn't fade, but something behind it shifted. Something colder, focused. She didn't answer yet. Jimmy leaned in a little further, pressing into the space between the two of them. "Let's get into it," he said, voice lower now. "Last month, during a press briefing, you defended some immigration remarks from Trump. A lot of people, and I mean a lot, called those remarks racist. Are you really comfortable standing behind them?" The studio fell silent. The temperature shifted. The audience, who moments ago were laughing at TikTok jokes, now leaned in with quiet, electric anticipation. Caroline's fingers tapped the armrest once, just once. Then she looked straight at Jimmy and spoke. If you actually watched the full briefing, and I'm guessing you only saw the viral clip, you'd know what I said. I wasn't justifying anything that wasn't real. The president was talking about border security. You and your colleagues decided to make it about race. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't waver. It just cut through the room. Jimmy smiled, but this time it didn't reach his eyes. He pulled out a folded sheet of paper from beneath the desk. I didn't just see a clip, he said, waving it slightly. I came prepared. He read it slowly. We need to keep this country clean. That's the quote. You don't think that word clean is a little loaded? A few gasps, some quiet laughter. A long exhale from somewhere in the front row. Karoline didn't flinch. He was talking about crime, she said. He was talking about the drug crisis. If you're going to quote him, quote the context too. Don't slice it up just to fit your monologue. That landed. A few people clapped. One person near the back yelled, "That's right," but another voice followed, calling, "Still sounds shady." Jimmy shrugged, feigning casual, but his voice grew more pointed. Context or not, you're his voice. When he's called a racist, do you ever stop and think, what am I actually defending here? Now it was Caroline's turn to lean in. She didn't blink. I know exactly what you want, Jimmy, she said. You want me to squirm. You want me to backpedal. You want a viral soundbite, but I'm not here to play your game. The audience didn't know what to do, applaud or hold their breath. Some did both. Caroline's smile came back, but it was tighter now, sharper, not soft, not soothing. A smirk with steel underneath. Jimmy, still smiling, folded the paper back into thirds and set it down, but his eyes said he wasn't done, not even close. Jimmy leaned back, fingers tapping lightly on the desk, but his tone sharpened like a blade pulled from its sheath. Let's stay on this for a minute, he said, because you say Trump was talking about crime, but let's look at your own words. February 15th on X, you posted, "We need a strong America unviolated by outsiders who destroy." He raised his eyebrows. Now you're the one saying outsiders. A lot of folks see that as a dog whistle. So what exactly were you trying to say? Karoline took a short breath, her posture unmoved. Her eyes locked onto his like she was daring him to blink. You really love scrolling through my ex, huh? She said, cool and collected. That post was about national security, about crime, about protecting our border. If someone wants to twist that into something else, that's on them, not me. Her tone didn't rise, but it carried a kind of heat, like she'd answered this 100 times before, but knew she'd have to answer it 100 more. She wasn't pleading. She was standing. Jimmy narrowed his eyes, not backing off. All right, he said, but I've got another clip. Let's roll it. He gestured to the screen behind them. The lights dimmed slightly as a video played. Karoline at the White House podium, her voice firm, her expression resolute. We can't let America become a dumping ground for those who don't belong here. The clip ended. The lights came back up, and Jimmy turned toward her, lips pursed like he already knew his next line would land hard. Don't belong here, he echoed, pausing on every word. Karoline, that's the kind of language people remember. That's the kind of line that doesn't go away. You represent someone who once called entire countries, you know what he said, holes. And now you're up there talking about who belongs and who doesn't. Do you ever feel like you're enabling that kind of rhetoric? The studio went quiet again. The tension had shifted from political to personal. Karoline glanced at the screen behind her, then turned back toward Jimmy. Her voice didn't flinch. You're good at editing, Jimmy, she said. But you know exactly what I was talking about. That line was about fentanyl smugglers. People crossing the border with chemicals that are killing Americans. More than 70,000 dead from synthetic opioids in a single year. I said what I meant, and I meant it about criminals, not immigrants, not people chasing the American dream, but you already knew that. She tilted her head slightly. Her smirk returned, but this one had weight behind it. A challenge. Some claps broke the silence. A man near the front shouted, She's right. Others, not so convinced, shook their heads or crossed their arms. Jimmy laughed, but it was the kind of laugh that comes after getting hit, not landing one. I'm not editing anything, he said. I'm quoting you. I'm showing you and your words on the record. But look, if you want to talk about crime, fine. Let's talk about crime. Let's talk about Trump retweeting conspiracy theories, racist memes, stuff I wouldn't even read on air. When you're the one standing at the podium after all that, don't you feel like you're defending the indefensible? Karoline didn't blink. She didn't lean back. If anything, she leaned forward. Okay, Jimmy, she said, her voice low but cutting. You want to talk retweets? Let's talk about your own jokes. You ever go back and watch some of your old man on the street bits, some of your sketches? Things that wouldn't fly today, and you know it. You want to act like you've got the moral high ground, but let's not pretend you're not playing a game too. The audience erupted. Laughter clashed with applause. A woman near the back shouted, "Burn!" A teenager near the aisle held up a phone, grinning like he'd just witnessed history. Jimmy raised his eyebrows. He didn't argue, at least not yet. He adjusted his mic and tapped his pen against the desk again, this time slower. Touché, he said, voice edged with grit. But I'm not behind the White House podium. You are. He leaned in, his voice dropped. And when Trump's called a racist by millions of Americans, don't you ever ask yourself what you're doing? The question dropped like a weight between them, the kind of line designed not to provoke a fight, but to force a reckoning. Karoline looked at him, not smiling now. Her tone shifted, not softer but more grounded. I ask myself that every single day, she said. I ask if I'm doing what's right, if I'm being honest, if I'm standing on something solid. But what I don't do is let people like you define who I am. I'm not here to win points. I'm here to speak the truth, even when you don't like how it sounds. She leaned forward just a little more. You want to call me an enabler? Fine. But I'm not going to sit here and let you twist what I say just because it fits your script. The crowd exploded. Cheers, applause, boos. Someone yelled, "She just won!" Phones went up in every direction. TikTokers were already editing captions in their heads. Jimmy exhaled, tapping his papers together. He smiled, but it was tighter now, more controlled. He glanced at the crowd, then back at her. Well, he said, you're not afraid to hit back. Karoline didn't move. She just nodded once. I don't hit back, she said. I stand where I started. Jimmy didn't let the applause linger. He tapped the desk once, then leaned forward, eyes locked on Karoline like he was lining up a final shot. All right, he said. Let's set politics aside for a second. Let me ask you something a little bigger. His voice dipped lower, more deliberate. You're a young woman, 27, part of Gen Z, a generation that talks about fairness, diversity, progress. How do you square that with standing behind someone like Trump? A hush swept the room. Not gasps, not tension, just silence. A long inhale, the kind of pause that made people sit up straighter. Karoline didn't blink. She didn't rush. She sat still, fingers lightly curled on the desk. Then she looked straight at Jimmy and past him toward the crowd. Her gaze wasn't cold, but it was sharp, intentional, pulling the audience into it like she wanted them to hear this part loud and clear. Jimmy, she said slowly, you think you get Gen Z because you read a few headlines or scroll through some TikToks. There were a few laughs, sharp, surprised, breaking the silence like a pin to glass. She leaned in just slightly, enough to signal she wasn't done. Her voice rose, not in volume, but in clarity. I'm not here to please everybody, and I'm sure as hell not here to live by a script you or anyone else wrote for me. Gen Z isn't a monolith. We're not all marching to one beat. We argue, we question, we challenge each other. That's our strength, not some curated checklist of hashtags and slogans. The crowd stirred. Scattered claps broke through. One voice from the left shouted, "Preach!" Jimmy opened his mouth like he was about to interrupt, but Karoline raised a hand, firm, not rude. She wasn't giving up this moment. You asked what I'd say to young people who feel betrayed by me standing where I stand, she continued. I'd tell them, look deeper. Don't let the media or influencers or algorithms decide for you. Don't let anybody box you into a narrative that doesn't fit just because it's trending. Her voice was steady, focused, like someone who'd rehearsed the message, but not the moment, like she knew the stakes. I do this job, she said, because I believe in a strong, safe country, not because I want to be a mascot for anybody's idea of progress. I show up every day with facts, with clarity, not emojis and slogans. That hit. Applause swelled across the studio. A young woman near the front stood up, phone in hand, filming the entire thing with tears in her eyes. Somewhere near the back, a guy about 19 shouted, "She's speaking for us!" Jimmy tilted his head. His smile returned, but there was something different in it now, strained behind the curve. He glanced toward the cameras, then leaned in. "Sounds nice," he said. "But let's not forget who you work for. You say Gen Z isn't a monolith, but when you defend Trump, a man who said things about women, immigrants, opponents, things I wouldn't even joke about on this show, don't you think you're sending a message whether you mean to or not?" He tapped the desk once, not loud, but enough to underline the point. Karoline didn't flinch. She leaned in too, closing the space between them, eyes locked on his like they were the only two people in the room. "My message is crystal clear, Jimmy," she said. "I'm not Trump. I'm not here to echo every word. I'm here to make sure the truth is heard, not the version that gets filtered through a script, not yours, not theirs, the actual truth." She paused. "Let that land. You say I'm sending a message by standing here. Well, what message are you sending? Sitting at that desk making a living mocking people like me, then pretending you're the moral voice of a generation you don't even understand." The crowd roared, this time louder than any moment before. Phones flew into the air. A girl in a hoodie near the stage held up a cardboard sign, "Karoline 3, Jimmy 0. Jimmy smiled, but it was thin now, worn at the edges. He sat back for a second, hands off the desk, eyes flickering with something that looked like recalculation. He nodded once, then leaned in again. "You're a fighter, I'll give you that," he said. "But here's what I really want to know. You're 27. You've got a future ahead of you. And you say Gen Z can think for itself. But when Trump's gone, 4 years from now or sooner, what do you want to be remembered for? A loyal mouthpiece? Or just a young woman caught in the machine?" There it was, the heart of it, the legacy question. The audience hushed again, every phone still recording. Even the lights seemed to lean forward. Karoline didn't rush. She exhaled slowly, then placed both hands flat on the desk, not clenched, not defensive, just grounded. "I don't care about being remembered for the job title," she said. "I'm not here to build statues or chase headlines. I'm here to work, to stand my ground, to speak the truth, even if it costs me popularity points with people like you." She paused, eyes unwavering. "You want to call me a mouthpiece? Go ahead, but I'm no one's puppet. I walk into every room on my own 2 feet, and I don't need applause to know I'm standing where I'm supposed to." The crowd roared again, some standing, some shaking their heads, all of them reacting. And somewhere in the chaos, a TikToker whispered into her phone, "She just made herself a movement." Jimmy didn't speak right away. The applause still rang in the studio, but his fingers had started tapping the desk again, quicker now. His smile had all but vanished, replaced by something tighter. The look of someone doing mental math, someone calculating how to pivot, how to land something that might level the playing field again. Then he leaned forward, slowly, and dropped his voice like it was a secret. "All right," he said. "You walk in on your own 2 feet. You speak your truth. Got it. But I want to ask one more thing, and I want a real answer, not a headline." Karoline didn't blink. She nodded once. Calm. Ready. Jimmy rested his elbows on the desk, fingers steepled in front of him. "When you defend Trump," he said, "a man who's been called racist, sexist, divisive, by opponents, by the press, by people who used to work for him, when you stand at that podium using your voice to carry his message, Don't you ever wonder if you're on the wrong side of history? The crowd fell silent. No claps, no phones in the air, just stillness, the kind that settles over a room when a question finally hits bone. Karoline didn't respond immediately. She sat still, absorbing it. Then she leaned forward, matching Jimmy's posture, her eyes sharper than before. Not angry, not defensive, just resolute. I wonder every day, Jimmy, she said, her voice lower now. I wonder if I'm doing it right. I wonder if I'm telling the truth the best I can. I wonder if I'm helping the country I love or just making noise in a room full of it. She took a breath. Not for show, not dramatic, just steady. But here's the difference, she continued. I wonder. I wrestle. I don't walk in with a teleprompter and a smile, pretending I'm above it all. I do the hard work. I sit in the storm. I take the hits. Her eyes narrowed just slightly. And I don't need you to be proud of me for that. Jimmy opened his mouth, but she wasn't done. You sit here every night mocking people like me, she said, her voice rising just a little. You call it comedy. You wrap it in sarcasm and jokes. But you're doing the same thing you accuse others of, spinning, shaping, turning people into caricatures so the audience claps. That struck. You could feel it. A pause stretched long, longer than most shows would allow. Even the crew behind the cameras stood still. Karoline leaned back now, folding her hands calmly. You say I'm selling out my generation, she said. But maybe you're the one selling something. You've turned cynicism into a product, made doubt into a brand. And now when someone shows up who doesn't match your script, you call them dangerous. The crowd stirred, a few quiet cheers. Someone clapped, slow but firm. Jimmy sat still, letting it sink in. Then he smiled again. This time more human, less edge. He tilted his head. You think I'm dangerous? Karoline shook her head gently. No, she said. I think you're stuck in a loop where you can't imagine a young woman doing this job unless she's lying or being used. Jimmy laughed softly, rubbing his hands together. I don't think you're being used, he said. I think you're smart. Really smart. That's what makes this harder. He leaned in again. Because when someone smart helps normalize what so many people believe is wrong, it hits different. Karoline's expression didn't change, but her reply came faster this time, sharper. You don't get to define what's normal, Jimmy, she said. You've had that mic for years. You've built your version of what's acceptable and what's outrageous. But not everyone lives in that version. Not everyone agrees with the script you've been writing for 2 decades. She gestured toward the audience, not wildly, just enough to signal that they were part of it too. There's a whole generation out here that's tired of being told who they're supposed to be, tired of having our values mocked, our faith questioned, our families dismissed, just because we don't clap at the same punchlines. That hit deep. The energy in the room changed again. This wasn't a debate anymore. It was something closer to a reckoning. Jimmy exhaled and leaned back, eyes flickering like he was trying to find the thread again. You're tough, he said quietly. I didn't expect this much fire. Karoline shrugged. You invited me. They both smiled. Not a warm moment, more like the moment after a boxing round ends, gloves still on, breathing heavy, but no one throwing punches. Then Jimmy tried again. All right, he said. One last question. No games, no gotchas. Just this. He pointed at her, his voice slowing. When this is all over, when your time at the podium ends, whether it's next year or in 10, what do you want people to say about you? The question hung there, real, human, honest. Karoline looked at him, then turned to the crowd. She didn't smile, she didn't blink, she just spoke. I want them to say I stood my ground, she said. That I didn't flinch when it was hard, that I didn't cave when it was unpopular, that I told the truth, not because it was easy or perfect or comfortable, but because it was mine to tell. Her voice tightened slightly, but not with nerves, with conviction. I didn't come here to be liked, she said. I came here to serve, and when I'm done, I won't measure my legacy by applause or headlines or trending clips. I'll measure it by whether I said what needed to be said, even when people didn't want to hear it. The room erupted. Some standing, some cheering, some stunned. Phones everywhere now. The noise was deafening. But in the middle of it all, Karoline sat still, hands folded, spine straight, eyes forward. Jimmy leaned back. His smirk had faded. All that remained was a quiet nod, not agreement, but recognition. "I guess that's your answer," he said softly. Karoline nodded once. "That's my legacy," she said, "and I own every word of it." The applause had barely faded when Jimmy leaned forward again, slower this time, eyes scanning the crowd before settling on Karoline. He wasn't smiling now, not even pretending. "Okay," he said. "You're tough, no question. You came here, you held your own, you threw punches." He paused just long enough to make the next line stick. "But don't think this ends just because you didn't back down, because there's one more thing I want to ask, and you might not like it." Karoline didn't shift, didn't flinch. She gave him the smallest nod, like she'd been waiting for the final shot. Jimmy exhaled, then dropped his voice low. "You say you don't need approval. You say you don't care about applause. But let's say Trump is gone 4 years from now, or sooner, and you're not at that podium anymore. When people look back, what do you think they'll see?" He let the question sit a second longer, then finished it with a strike. "A loyal mouthpiece? Or just a young woman who got swallowed by the machine?" The studio went silent. Not a pin drop kind of silence. A heavy, unmoving kind. The kind that holds its breath waiting to see if someone's about to stand or fold. Karoline looked at him, not with shock, not even anger, just stillness. A kind of clarity that comes when the last round's already been decided. She leaned in slowly, voice low, words deliberate. "My legacy," she said, "won't be defined by headlines or hashtags." Her eyes didn't waver. "I'm not here to build monuments or chase approval from talk show hosts. I'm here because I believe in something, something real, something hard, something messy. I believe in this country. I believe in truth, even when it's uncomfortable, even when you don't clap for it." Jimmy watched her, his hand frozen halfway to the desk. Karoline kept going. Calm, even, unapologetic. "You can call me a mouthpiece. You can say I've been used. You can put whatever label you want on me. But I know who I am. I know why I wake up and do this every day. I'm not a puppet. I'm not a parrot. I'm Karoline Leavitt, and I stand on my own 2 feet." The crowd exploded. Phones flew up. A group near the front stood and cheered. Someone near the wings yelled, "Post it now." A young girl in a denim jacket mouthed the line to herself as she typed it into her phone. "I stand on my own 2 feet." Jimmy sat back. His fingers tapped the desk again, but slower now. The smile tried to come back, but it didn't land like before. "On your own 2 feet," he repeated. "Sounds good, but I bet Trump's clapping somewhere backstage." The crowd gave a half laugh, unsure if they were supposed to. Karoline didn't blink. "Maybe he is," she said. "But I don't need his applause, and I definitely don't need yours." Jimmy arched a brow, caught off guard. Karoline leaned in just once more, voice calm but sharp as a blade drawn slowly. "You want a soundbite to wrap this show? Fine, here's your last truth." She paused, let the silence grow. "You hold the mic, Jimmy, but I hold my ground. That's what Gen Z respects. That's what this moment was really about." The applause erupted again, louder than anything before. It didn't sound like a studio. It sounded like an arena. Jimmy didn't say a word, just nodded once, slowly, like a man who knew he'd lost the last round but didn't hate who beat him. He turned to the camera. "Well, Karoline Leavitt, everybody." The crowd cheered, scattered whoops rising above the roar. Karoline didn't rush to leave. She reached out, shook his hand, firm, quick, no overplay. Their eyes met just long enough to say they both knew what had happened. The music kicked back in, but the energy didn't go back to normal. People were still standing, still clapping, still shouting. A teenager in the front row looked straight into his phone camera and said, "She didn't survive the show. She owned it." The camera panned across the studio, capturing faces still reeling, still unsure if they'd watched an interview, a takedown, or the start of something bigger. And backstage, as Karoline stepped behind the curtain, someone handed her a bottle of water. "You lit the place up," they whispered. She gave a small smile, one that didn't need validation, one that already knew. The music blared again, but it couldn't drown out the aftershock rippling through the studio. People weren't sitting. They weren't checking their phones casually. They were on their feet, buzzing, debating, capturing the last second of what felt more like a political earthquake than a talk show segment. In the front row, a young guy, maybe 20, turned to his friend with wide eyes and a grin stretching ear to ear. "She just crushed Jimmy," he whispered, then opened his phone, swiping fast. "I'm posting this to X right now. #Leavitt Peace." His friend laughed, nodding hard, eyes still locked on the stage like he couldn't believe what he'd just seen. Behind them, a teenage girl stood holding a cardboard sign with crooked Sharpie letters, "Karoline 2, Jimmy 0. She raised it high. A few rows back, an older woman, maybe late 50s, sat with her arms crossed tight against her chest. She turned to the man beside her, lips pursed. "She's just a mouthpiece," she whispered, too confident for her own good. The man nodded slowly. Kimmel should have pushed harder. She dodged everything. The crowd wasn't unified. It was fractured, excited, conflicted, electrified. Near the side exit, 3 college students huddled up filming a selfie video. The one in the middle held the phone up while the other 2 leaned in. "Guys, we just saw Karoline Leavitt burn Jimmy Kimmel down. Live." The one on the left laughed. "She's real Gen Z, no fear, no filter." The girl on the right chimed in, "Follow us for the clip. This one's gonna go viral." Across the studio, another group stood, arms crossed, debating quietly. "She didn't answer half the questions," one said. "No," the other replied, "but she didn't run from them either. That's the difference." Up near the stage, a man held up his phone as he shouted into it, "She spoke for us." Finally, no apologies, no sugarcoating, just truth. And all around them, the sound of swipes and taps, thumbs flying across screens, clips already being trimmed and tagged. X, Instagram, TikTok. It was already spreading before the next guest had even entered the wings. Backstage, the energy was no calmer. A crew member leaned into her headset. "We need to ride this momentum after break. That just blew up the room." Jimmy Kimmel sat at his desk, now alone under the hot lights, tapping one finger softly on the wood surface. He didn't speak, not yet. His expression was unreadable, a smirk trying to return but not quite finding its footing, something between surprise, irritation, and reluctant respect. And behind the curtain, Karoline stood still for a second. She hadn't taken off her mic yet. She hadn't moved. Her high heels rested quiet on the black floor. She took a single breath, then looked at her assistant, who'd rushed over with a water bottle and a wide grin. "You did great," the assistant whispered. Karoline smiled back. Not wide, not boastful, just the calm smile of someone who knew exactly what she came here to do, and had done it. It didn't take long. Within minutes of Karoline stepping off that stage, the moment had already leapt out of the studio and into the bloodstream of the internet. First came the clips. A 30-second video hit X less than 5 minutes after the segment ended, shot from the 4th row. It opened right at the mic drop. "You hold the mic, Jimmy." But I hold my ground. The caption read, "She didn't blink once. Leavitt versus Kimmel." It hit over 10,000 views in 10 minutes. The quote was already starting to trend. Another clip followed from a different angle, this one catching her smirk right after Jimmy mentioned Trump clapping backstage. Captioned, "When Gen Z shuts down old media in real time," it soared past 100,000 views before the end of the hour. Comments flooded in, some praising, some mocking, all energized. "She torched him. She's just Trump with better lighting." I don't care who she works for, that confidence is unmatched. On TikTok, the energy doubled. A creator with 3.2 million followers posted a stitched reaction, her eyes widening as Karoline delivered the legacy line, followed by a dramatic reenactment in her own bedroom, bathrobe and all. This girl didn't just survive Jimmy, she owned him. Hashtag number Leavitt fires. Back began trending within an hour, followed by number Gen Z fights back, number Kimmel checkmate, and the inevitable remix edit. Karoline's toughest lines played over a slowed-down orchestral version of Eminem's Lose Yourself. The comment section filled with fire emojis and users declaring, "We finally have someone who speaks our language, even if we don't agree with her." But the split was real. Not everyone was cheering. A prominent political account on X posted a thread titled, "Why Karoline Leavitt's Media Strategy Works, but Why It's Dangerous." It argued that her performance was less about substance and more about optics jujitsu, leveraging Gen Z's distrust of mainstream media without ever truly answering for Trump's record. Within minutes, the replies were full of arguments. Some said she dodged the hard stuff. Others argued she did something more important. She reframed the conversation. "Karoline didn't dodge," one user replied. "She re-centered. That's what media veterans hate." Meanwhile, meme pages had already gone to work. One viral image showed Jimmy blinking mid-sentence with text overlaid, "When you realize the 27-year-old isn't here to smile and agree." Another showed Karoline mid-glare with the caption, "Me explaining to my professor why I didn't follow the assignment, but still nailed it." On Reddit, the politics forum exploded. A thread titled Karoline versus Kimmel, who won, had over 2,000 comments in the first hour. One top comment read, "You don't have to like her to admit she owned that stage." Another, right below it, "Owned it." She did a TED Talk for Fox News. Back on TikTok, a trending challenge had already begun. A Stand Your Ground challenge, duet-style videos of users lip-syncing Karoline's biggest lines or giving their own versions of shutting down a tough question. On YouTube, political reaction channels flooded the homepage. One video titled Karoline Leavitt Destroys Jimmy Kimmel, Full Breakdown, had over 50,000 views within the first hour. The host paused after each of Karoline's major lines, adding commentary like, "That's the media game flip right there. She didn't get defensive, she made him explain himself." On the other side, a rival channel released a rebuttal titled Leavitt Dodged Every Real Question. Here's what she didn't say. It too racked up views, its comment section a war zone of digital debate. Meanwhile, traditional media was scrambling to keep up. CNN posted a breaking headline on its site. Karoline Leavitt holds her ground, intense Jimmy Kimmel exchange. The article praised her composure but noted her deflections. A political analyst quoted in the piece called it a generational collision crafted for social media, not policy clarity. Fox News was faster and louder. Their headline, Gen Z powerhouse Karoline Leavitt shuts down Jimmy Kimmel in live studio clash. Within their segment, one pundit declared, "She didn't just win the night. She changed the rules of engagement." Even international outlets jumped in. The BBC ran a short segment titled America's Youngest Press Secretary Sparks Firestorm on late-night TV, calling Karoline a masterclass in generational brand control. A German outlet described the interview as the clearest reflection yet of America's fractured media ecosystem and how Gen Z has learned to navigate it like pros. And then came the influencers. A Gen Z political creator with over 4 million followers on TikTok posted a video just after midnight. "Look, I don't agree with everything she said, but that was a masterclass. That was presence. That was pressure handled. Respect where it's due." Another popular creator, more progressive, fired back, "She played the victim. Classic gaslight strategy. But yeah, she's media trained as hell. Scary good." The comment sections weren't just debates, they were battlegrounds. Clips of Karoline saying, "I don't need your applause, I need to speak the truth," were now stitched into music edits, motivational reels, and fan cam style edits usually reserved for pop stars and athletes. It was no longer just a segment, It was a moment, a turning point. The clash between talk show host and political firebrand had morphed into something much bigger, fuel for a fractured nation's attention span. And Gen Z wasn't just watching it, they were remixing it, debating it, co-authoring its meaning in real time. Karoline hadn't left the building an hour, and already she was everywhere. While social media was busy dissecting every frame, every smirk, every silence, legacy media wasted no time either. The story had crossed out of the studio and into the newsrooms before the interview even finished airing on the West Coast. CNN was the first to drop a headline. Karoline Leavitt holds her ground in fiery exchange with Jimmy Kimmel. The article painted her as confident and media-savvy, calling her polished, sharp, and clearly prepared. But it didn't shy away from critique either. For all her composure, the piece noted, Leavitt skirted the harder questions on Trump's rhetoric and record. A quote from a senior political correspondent stood out. This wasn't about policy, it was about posture, and Karoline understands how to own posture. Over at Fox News, the tone was far less mixed. Their top story, Gen Z star Karoline Leavitt wipes the floor with Jimmy Kimmel. The article ran with her viral lines, "You hold the mic, I hold my ground, and I'm no one's puppet," as if they were campaign slogans. A Fox contributor wrote, "She didn't just defend herself, she made Kimmel look like the face of outdated media arrogance. This is the kind of unapologetic leadership young conservatives have been waiting for." NBC News took a more measured route. Their coverage framed it as a symbolic cultural clash, not just between two political figures, but between two media worlds. Kimmel brought the traditional fire, they wrote, but Leavitt brought something more elusive, control in the chaos. Across the Atlantic, the BBC chimed in with a headline that leaned into global relevance. America's youngest press secretary sparks internet frenzy after late-night clash. Their take was less about Trump and more about generational dynamics. They noted how Karoline used silence, poise, and digital fluency to navigate the space between confrontation and clarity. Even German and French outlets took interest. One German newspaper compared the event to a political sport match, writing, Leavitt came armed with TikTok timing and courtroom precision, turning an ambush into a debut. Meanwhile, the New York Times ran a piece titled, Message Control in the Age of Chaos, examining how Karoline's interview became a case study in media framing and identity politics. They praised her tactical brilliance while warning about the implications. In a country desperate for clarity, confidence can easily be mistaken for truth. What united nearly all the coverage, left, right, and center, was the acknowledgement of one simple fact. Karoline Leavitt had arrived. Whether she was seen as a brave voice of a new generation or a polished defender of a divisive agenda, no one could deny her command of the moment. The interview was no longer just late-night entertainment. It was front-page news. By morning, the moment had already transformed into myth. Clips were everywhere. Edits, memes, think pieces, college campus debates, podcast segments, reaction videos. And the same quote, repeated again and again like a mantra written for the digital age, "You hold the mic, I hold my ground." But beneath the hashtags and highlight reels, something deeper was at play. This wasn't just a late-night sparring match. It wasn't just a political flame war. It was a collision. Between generations, between institutions, between two very different versions of what power is supposed to look like. Karoline Leavitt had walked into a space where young conservatives are usually mocked, minimized, or avoided altogether. She didn't come to be agreeable. She didn't flinch under pressure. And whether viewers loved her or loathed her, one thing was clear. She never stopped owning the moment. For Gen Z viewers, especially those frustrated with legacy media and political double standards, her appearance hit different. She didn't try to be everyone's favorite. She didn't soften her tone to appear palatable. She claimed youth as strength, not weakness. And in doing so, she reshaped what it means to be a young voice in American politics. And yet the reactions revealed something else, just how divided the country remains. Some saw courage, others saw spin, some saw truth-telling, Others saw evasion. Some saw a new kind of leader. Others saw just another face on a polarized screen. But maybe that was the point. In an era when clarity is often mistaken for agreement and confidence mistaken for correctness, Karoline's performance challenged everyone, supporters and critics alike, to rethink what authenticity looks like. She didn't plead for approval. She demanded a different kind of attention, the kind that forces people to re-listen, re-watch, re-evaluate. The questions she left behind weren't just about Trump or immigration or media responsibility. They were about legacy. What does it mean to stand for something in a world that spins faster than ever? What does it mean to hold your ground when you're surrounded by judgment, on screen, online, in real time? And what happens when someone from a generation known for memes, short attention spans, and digital chaos brings structure to the storm? Karoline Leavitt answered all of that without breaking her voice, raising her volume, or losing her footing. She didn't come to please the room. She came to own the space. And whether that space turns into a stepping stone for future office, a symbol for modern conservatism, or just a viral footnote in the story of Gen Z's political rise, it left an impact that couldn't be ignored. Because in an America torn between noise and nuance, between broadcast and broadband, between who holds the mic and who shapes the message, sometimes all it takes is one moment, one conversation, one voice refusing to fold. And for Karoline Leavitt, that moment didn't define her. She defined it. She held her ground. Now it's your turn. If this moment made you feel something, don't just watch. Like the video, share the story, and subscribe for more unapologetic voices that challenge the script.